Most people passed by her every day without noticing her. She was the kind of person who blended into the background wherever she went. She lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town, worked long hours at a local office, and followed the same routine almost every day. She woke up early, took the bus to work, returned home in the evening, made a simple dinner, and spent the rest of her night reading or listening to music. Nothing about her life seemed unusual. At least that was what everyone thought. The truth was that she carried a quiet love for music that had stayed with her since childhood. It wasn't something she talked about. In fact, very few people knew she could play the piano at all. Years earlier, music had been a big part of her life. She had spent countless hours practicing, learning melodies, and finding comfort in the sound of piano keys. But as life became busier and responsibilities grew heavier, she slowly drifted away from it. The piano became something she remembered rather than something she played. Still, whenever she heard a beautiful melody, something inside her would wake up. One Saturday afternoon, she decided to attend a small community event at a neighborhood center. The event was nothing special. Local residents were gathering for an afternoon of conversation, homemade food, and simple activities. She almost didn't go. After a long week at work, staying home seemed much easier. But something pushed her to leave the apartment and try something different. When she arrived, the building was already busy. Children ran through the hallways laughing. Older residents sat around tables sharing stories. Volunteers moved back and forth carrying trays of food and drinks. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. She found a quiet corner and sat alone for a while, simply watching people enjoy themselves. That was when she noticed it. Near one of the walls stood an old piano. It looked worn from years of use. The wood had faded in places, and a few scratches covered the surface. Most people walked past it without giving it a second glance. She couldn't stop looking at it. A volunteer noticed her staring. "Nobody really plays that anymore," the volunteer said with a smile. "It's mostly decoration these days." She nodded and smiled politely, but her eyes remained fixed on the piano. For several minutes she sat quietly, debating with herself. She hadn't played in front of strangers for years, maybe even longer. The thought made her nervous. What if she had forgotten too much? What if people stopped and listened? What if she made mistakes? The questions filled her mind. Then she looked around the room. Nobody seemed to be paying attention. Everyone was busy talking, eating, or helping with the event. She slowly stood from her chair. A few steps later, she found herself standing beside the piano. Her fingers lightly touched the surface. For a moment she almost turned around and walked away. Instead, she sat down. The bench creaked softly beneath her. She took a slow breath. Then she placed her hands on the keys. The first notes were simple. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. Just a gentle melody she remembered from years ago. The sound floated quietly through the room. At first, nobody noticed. Conversations continued. Plates clattered. Children laughed. The music blended into the background. She didn't mind. In fact, that made it easier. She kept playing. One note after another. The melody flowed naturally, almost as if her fingers had been waiting all these years to find the keys again. As she played, something surprising happened. The nervousness began to disappear. The worries that had followed her all week seemed to fade away. For those few moments, there was only the music. A woman standing near the refreshments table slowly turned toward the piano. Then an older man sitting nearby looked up from his conversation. A volunteer carrying a tray paused for a second. None of them spoke. They simply listened. The melody wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. Yet something about it felt comforting. Warm. Familiar. The pianist didn't notice the growing attention. Her focus remained entirely on the music. More people gradually became aware of the sound. Some stopped talking. Others moved a little closer. Even the children seemed calmer. The room hadn't become silent, but it had definitely changed. The atmosphere felt different. People weren't gathering because they expected a performance. They were gathering because the music made them feel something. A sense of peace. A sense of comfort. A reminder of simpler times. When she finally reached the last notes, she let her hands rest quietly in her lap. The melody ended. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The silence surprised her. She looked up and suddenly realized people were watching. Her heart skipped. She wasn't expecting an audience. Then someone began clapping. A few others joined. Within moments, applause filled the room. It wasn't the loud kind heard at major concerts. It was genuine, warm, appreciative. The kind that comes from people who have truly enjoyed something. She felt her face grow warm. Embarrassed, she stood up from the bench. "You were wonderful," an older woman said. Another person nodded. "That was beautiful. I haven't heard that piano sound that good in years." She thanked them quietly. The attention made her uncomfortable. She wasn't looking for praise. She had only wanted to play a simple tune. Nothing more. Yet people continued approaching her. Several asked if she had learned music professionally. Others wondered if she would play again later. One elderly gentleman smiled and said the melody reminded him of happy memories from long ago. His eyes seemed brighter as he spoke. That comment stayed with her. The event continued, but the mood remained different. People seemed more connected somehow. Strangers who hadn't spoken earlier now shared conversations. Others smiled more, laughed more. Even the volunteers noticed the change. As the afternoon went on, several attendees asked her if she would play another song. At first she politely declined. She didn't want to become the center of attention. But eventually she agreed. This time more people gathered before she even touched the keys. Word had already spread throughout the building. "The woman who plays piano is starting again." She heard someone whisper those words. It made her smile. The second melody was just as simple as the first. Yet once again the room seemed to slow down. People listened. Not because the music was technically impressive. Not because it was complicated. But because it felt honest. Real. The kind of music that spoke quietly rather than demanding attention. By the end of the afternoon, dozens of people had heard her play. Many approached her before leaving. They thanked her. Some shared personal stories. Others simply shook her hand. She found herself overwhelmed by the kindness. When the event finally ended, she gathered her things and prepared to leave. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. She walked toward the bus stop feeling strangely lighter than she had in weeks. The day had not gone the way she expected. She had arrived as a stranger, someone nobody noticed. Yet she left knowing she had touched people in a way she never intended. As the bus carried her home, she replayed the afternoon in her mind. The old piano, the simple melodies, the smiles, the applause, the conversations. Most of all, she remembered the look on people's faces while they listened. There had been something special in those moments. Something difficult to explain. When she reached her apartment that evening, she placed her keys on the table and sat quietly by the window. The city lights flickered outside. Normally, she would have turned on the television or opened a book. Instead, she sat in silence, thinking. The old piano remained in her thoughts. So did the people. For years she had believed music was simply a hobby she had left behind. Something from another chapter of her life. But now she wasn't so sure. A simple tune had changed the atmosphere of an entire room. A few forgotten melodies had brought strangers together. And somehow, without planning it, she had given people something they needed. She just didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. The next time she returned to the community center, even more people would be waiting. And the simple piano tunes that started as a quiet moment for herself would soon become something nobody could have imagined. The following week felt longer than usual. Ever since the community event, she found herself thinking about the old piano almost every day. During work, small pieces of the melodies would drift through her mind. While riding the bus home, she would remember the faces of the people who had stopped to listen. What surprised her most was not the applause. It was the reactions, the smiles, the conversations, the way complete strangers had connected through a few simple notes. Even so, she wasn't sure if she should return. Part of her felt that the previous Saturday had been a one-time moment. Maybe people had simply been polite. Maybe they had enjoyed something different during the event and nothing more. But another part of her was curious. By Friday evening, she had already made her decision. She would go back. The next afternoon, she arrived at the community center a little earlier than before. As she approached the entrance, she immediately noticed something different. Several people standing outside recognized her. One woman smiled and waved. An elderly gentleman nodded warmly. Another person opened the door and said, "I'm glad you came back." The welcome caught her by surprise. She thanked them and stepped inside. The building felt familiar now. Children were once again running through the hallways. Volunteers were preparing refreshments. Groups of residents were chatting around tables. But something else was happening. People kept looking toward the entrance. Toward her. Word had apparently spread much faster than she expected. A volunteer approached with a smile. "We were hoping you'd come today." She laughed softly. "Were you?" "Absolutely. People have been asking about you all week." The response made her slightly uncomfortable but also touched her heart. Nobody had ever waited for her arrival before. Not like this. As she walked farther into the room, she noticed the old piano. It sat in the same corner as before. The faded wood and scratched surface looked exactly the same. Yet somehow it felt different. Almost welcoming. Like an old friend waiting patiently. She took a seat nearby and spent some time talking with people. Several residents approached her. Many wanted to thank her for playing the previous week. Others shared stories she never expected to hear. One elderly woman explained that the music reminded her of evenings spent with her parents when she was young. A retired teacher said he had not listened to live piano music in over 20 years. A young mother explained that her children had talked about the performance for days. The stories continued. Each one was simple, yet each one carried meaning. She began realizing something important. People weren't just listening to music. They were connecting their own memories to it. The melodies became bridges leading them back to moments they had almost forgotten. That afternoon, more people seemed to arrive than usual. Volunteers noticed it too. Some visitors had come specifically because they heard someone was playing piano. Others were curious after hearing friends talk about the previous gathering. The room gradually filled with energy. Before long, several people encouraged her to sit at the piano. She hesitated. The crowd felt larger this time. Much larger. But eventually she walked over and took her seat. The conversations slowly faded. Not completely. Just enough for people to listen. She placed her fingers on the keys. The first melody was soft and gentle. Simple notes floated through the room. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. People relaxed. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others closed their eyes. Children who had been running around suddenly slowed down. Even the volunteers seemed to pause for a moment. The music wasn't demanding attention. It simply filled the space with warmth. As she continued playing, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone near one of the windows. He had been present the previous week as well. Today he seemed especially focused on the music. His eyes remained fixed on the piano. When the melody ended, he quietly approached her. For a moment, he looked as though he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "My wife loved that tune." She smiled gently. "I'm glad it brought back a good memory." The man nodded. "It did." He paused. "We used to dance in our living room when we were younger. Nothing fancy. Just the two of us." His eyes became slightly watery. "She always asked me to stop worrying about life and enjoy the moment." The room around them seemed to disappear as he shared the memory. "I haven't thought about that evening in years," he said quietly. "Your music brought it back." She didn't know what to say. The memory clearly meant a great deal to him. So she simply listened. Sometimes that was enough. Before leaving, he thanked her again. His smile looked lighter than before. That conversation stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. A few songs later, another unexpected moment occurred. A middle-aged woman approached carrying a small photograph. She sat beside the piano after the performance ended. "I wanted to show you something." The woman handed her the picture. It showed two young children sitting at a piano many years earlier. "My brother and I," she smiled. "We used to play together every weekend." The woman looked down at the photograph. "He moved far away years ago." She laughed softly. "Life got busy." There was a pause. "We hardly talk anymore." The woman explained that hearing the piano had reminded her of those childhood afternoons. After last week's event, she had called her brother for the first time in months. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. "We laughed more than we have in years." She wiped away a small tear. "So thank you." Again, she found herself speechless. How could a few simple melodies create moments like these? She wasn't performing complex concert pieces. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Yet people kept sharing stories that touched her deeply. As the afternoon continued, the gathering grew larger. More chairs were brought into the room. Some visitors stood along the walls. Others sat on the floor. Nobody seemed to mind. The atmosphere felt relaxed and friendly. Several children even gathered near the piano. They watched her hands move across the keys with fascination. One little girl asked if playing piano was difficult. She smiled. "Sometimes." The child tilted her head. "Then why do you do it?" The question made several adults nearby laugh. She thought for a moment. "Because it makes people happy." The child nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Then she returned to her seat. As the day moved forward, something unusual became clear. People who had arrived as strangers were beginning to interact with one another. Conversations started naturally. Stories were exchanged. New friendships appeared. One person would mention a memory triggered by a song, and another would respond with a similar experience. The piano had somehow become the center of something much larger. Not a performance. Connection. A reason for people to gather. A reason to talk. A reason to listen. Even the community center staff noticed. Attendance was noticeably higher than normal. The director quietly mentioned that she had not seen this level of participation in a long time. The comment surprised her. She never imagined her music could affect the center itself. Late in the afternoon, she played one final melody. The room fell unusually quiet. Every note seemed to carry through the building. People listened carefully, not because they expected perfection, but because the music had become part of their shared experience. When the final note faded, applause filled the room once again. This time, however, it felt different. Not bigger, more personal. As though everyone present was expressing gratitude for something beyond the music itself. She stood and thanked everyone. Then she prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, several people stopped her. One asked if she would return next week. Another asked if she could play a favorite melody sometime. A volunteer joked that they might need a larger room soon. Everyone laughed. She promised she would come back if her schedule allowed. The reactions were immediate. Smiles appeared everywhere. As she walked outside, the cool evening air greeted her. The sun was beginning to set. She started toward the bus stop, carrying a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Purpose. Not the kind connected to work or responsibilities. A different kind. The feeling that something she loved could genuinely help others. Back at home, she sat near the window once again. The city lights slowly appeared across the streets below. She thought about the elderly man and his wife. The woman who called her brother. The children who watched the piano with wide eyes. The conversations. The smiles. The memories. The stories. None of it felt accidental anymore. Something was happening. Something she couldn't fully explain. And somewhere inside the community center, people were already talking about next Saturday. What she didn't know was that word about the quiet pianist was beginning to spread beyond the building. Soon, people from neighboring areas would start showing up. And the small gathering around an old piano would become far bigger than anyone expected. The following Saturday arrived faster than she expected. Throughout the week, her routine remained mostly the same. She went to work, rode the bus home, prepared simple meals, and spent quiet evenings in her apartment. Yet something had changed. People at the community center had stayed in her thoughts. Their stories, their memories, the smiles that appeared whenever she sat at the piano. For the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to the weekend. When Saturday finally arrived, she left home a little earlier than usual. She expected another pleasant afternoon with familiar faces. Nothing more. As she approached the community center, she immediately sensed something was different. Cars filled much of the parking area. Groups of people stood near the entrance talking. Some carried cups of coffee. Others chatted excitedly while waiting outside. She slowed her steps. The crowd looked much larger than before. At first, she assumed another event was taking place. But as she got closer, she heard something surprising. That's her. A woman pointed gently in her direction. Several people turned. Smiles appeared. Someone waved. The realization hit her. Many of them were there because of the piano. She felt both honored and nervous. Inside the building, the community center was busier than she had ever seen it. Volunteers moved between tables arranging extra chairs. People filled nearly every corner of the room. Some faces were familiar from previous weeks. Many others were completely new. The director greeted her almost immediately. "You should see this place." She looked around. The director laughed. "We haven't had attendance like this in years." "What happened?" she asked. The director smiled. "People told their friends." That simple answer explained everything. One person shared a story. Then another. Soon entire families became curious. The news had traveled farther than anyone expected. As she made her way through the room, strangers approached her. Many introduced themselves. Several explained they had heard wonderful things about the piano sessions. Others said friends insisted they attend. One elderly couple had driven nearly an hour just to visit. A young father said his neighbor would not stop talking about the music. The attention still felt unusual. She never considered herself special. She was simply someone who enjoyed playing piano. Yet the growing crowd suggested that something meaningful was happening. The atmosphere carried a sense of anticipation. People were excited, not because they expected a concert, but because they were looking forward to sharing an experience. That difference mattered. When she finally sat at the piano, the room naturally grew quieter. No announcement was needed. People simply noticed. Conversations softened. Children found seats. Volunteers paused their work. She took a slow breath. Then she began playing. The familiar notes filled the room. Immediately, the tension she had been carrying disappeared. The piano felt comfortable now. The melodies flowed naturally. The audience listened carefully. Some closed their eyes. Others smiled. A few gently tapped their feet to the rhythm. The room seemed connected by something invisible. As the music continued, she noticed a young woman sitting near the back. Unlike most listeners, she appeared emotional. Her eyes remained fixed on the piano. After several songs, the young woman approached during a break. "I wanted to thank you." Her voice was soft. The pianist smiled. "For what?" The young woman hesitated. Then she answered honestly. "My grandfather used to play piano." She paused. "He passed away a few years ago." The room around them felt quieter as she continued. "I haven't listened to live piano music since then." The young woman looked down briefly. "When you play, it reminds me of sitting beside him while he practiced." A small smile appeared. "They were some of my favorite memories." The pianist listened carefully. The story touched her deeply. The young woman thanked her once again before returning to her seat. That conversation became one of many. Throughout the afternoon, people continued sharing personal stories. One man explained that the music helped him feel calmer after a stressful week. A retired nurse said the melodies reminded her to slow down and enjoy simple moments. Another visitor described how the gatherings had given her something positive to look forward to. Again and again, she heard similar comments. The piano itself had become important, but the real impact seemed to come from the feeling it created. People left their worries outside for a while. They connected with memories. They connected with each other. And perhaps most importantly, they felt less alone. As the weeks passed, that sense of connection continued growing. Every Saturday brought larger crowds. The community center staff began preparing for the increase. More chairs appeared. Additional refreshments were ordered. Volunteers adjusted schedules to help manage the visitors. Nobody complained. In fact, everyone seemed excited. The increased attendance brought fresh energy into the building. Programs that once struggled for participation suddenly attracted interest. People stayed longer. Conversations lasted deeper into the afternoon. New friendships formed. The piano sessions had become something of a weekly tradition. One afternoon, while she was preparing to leave, she overheard a conversation between two visitors. "I met 3 new friends here." The first person laughed. "Me too. Funny how a piano brought everyone together." The second person nodded. "It wasn't the piano." "What do you mean?" "It's the feeling." The comment stayed with her. Maybe that was exactly what was happening. People were searching for connection. The music simply opened the door. Several weeks later, something unexpected happened. A man carrying a notebook entered the community center. Unlike most visitors, he spent much of the afternoon observing. He spoke with volunteers. He chatted with residents. He watched the crowd carefully. Eventually, he introduced himself. He worked for a small local newspaper. A friend had told him about the growing gatherings. At first, he thought the story sounded unusual. Now he wanted to see it for himself. The pianist immediately felt nervous. She had never imagined attracting media attention. The idea seemed almost ridiculous. Yet the reporter appeared genuinely interested, not in her as a performer, but in what was happening around the piano. He spent time speaking with many attendees. The responses amazed him. People shared stories about renewed friendships. Others described cherished memories triggered by certain melodies. Several explained how the weekly gatherings had improved their mood and given them something positive to anticipate. The reporter filled pages of notes. The more he listened, the more curious he became. Before leaving, he approached the pianist. "I expected a music story." She smiled. "And?" He looked around the room. "This isn't really about music." She laughed softly. "No." He shook his head. "It's about people." That answer surprised her. But the more she thought about it, the more accurate it seemed. The piano was only part of the story. The real story was happening among the listeners. The conversations, the memories, the friendships, the shared moments. The following week, the reporter returned. Then he came back again. Each visit revealed something new. One afternoon, he watched a group of seniors laughing together after the performance. Another day, he noticed children sitting beside older residents, exchanging stories. The community center felt alive in a way few expected. The reporter became fascinated. Eventually, he asked if he could write an article. She almost said no. The attention still made her uncomfortable. But the director encouraged her. The article could help people learn about the community center itself. It might even attract support for future programs. After some thought, she agreed. A few days later, the reporter sat down with her for a conversation. The interview felt simple. He asked about the piano, her love of music, the first day she decided to play, the growing crowds. Most importantly, he asked how she felt about everything that was happening. She thought carefully before answering. "I never expected any of this." The reporter smiled. "Then why do you keep coming back?" She looked around the community center. Several people were already arriving for the afternoon gathering. Some waved when they saw her. Others smiled warmly. The answer became obvious. Because people leave happier than when they arrived. The reporter quietly wrote down her words. Neither of them realized how important that interview would soon become. The article was still being prepared. The story had not yet reached the wider community. But the momentum was growing. Every week, more people appeared. Every week, new stories emerged. And every week, the simple piano tunes continued bringing strangers together. As she sat at the piano that afternoon and began another melody, she looked across the room. The crowd was larger than ever. Children sat beside grandparents. Neighbors chatted like old friends. Volunteers moved through the room with smiles on their faces. The community center felt transformed. What started as a quiet moment beside an old piano had become something much bigger. And unknown to everyone present, the newspaper article would soon introduce their story to thousands more people. When that happened, everything would change once again. A few days after the interview, life continued normally for her. She still woke up early each morning. She still rode the same bus to work. She still returned home in the evening and enjoyed the quiet comfort of her small apartment. Yet beneath that normal routine, something was changing. The reporter had promised to publish the article soon. She tried not to think too much about it. After all, she had never wanted attention. The piano gatherings were never about becoming known. They were simply about sharing music. Still, she could not deny her curiosity. She wondered what the article would say. More importantly, she wondered how people would react. A week later, the answer arrived. Early one morning, the director of the community center called her. The excitement in the director's voice was impossible to miss. "The article is out." She smiled. "Already?" "Yes, and people are reading it." The director sounded almost overwhelmed. Throughout the morning, messages continued arriving. Volunteers shared copies of the article. Visitors sent kind notes. Several people called the community center asking about the piano gatherings. By lunchtime, it was clear that the story had reached far more people than anyone expected. That evening, she finally sat down and read the article herself. The headline focused on the unusual transformation happening at the community center. It described how a forgotten piano had become the center of a growing community. The article included stories from visitors, memories shared by elderly residents, friendships formed between strangers, families spending time together, children discovering a love for music. The reporter had captured something important. He had understood that the story was never about a performer. It was about people finding connection. As she continued reading, she noticed something else. Near the end of the article, the reporter had included part of their interview. He shared her words about wanting people to leave happier than when they arrived. Seeing the sentence printed on the page felt strange. Yet it also felt honest, because that was exactly how she felt. The following Saturday brought another surprise. When she arrived at the community center, the crowd was larger than ever. Some visitors had traveled from neighboring towns. Others had learned about the gatherings through friends or family. A few had read the article online and decided to visit. Volunteers rushed to arrange additional seating. People filled nearly every available space. The director stood near the entrance, shaking her head in disbelief. "We've never seen anything like this." The pianist laughed softly. Neither had she. The old piano still sat in its familiar corner. Yet now it seemed to represent something much bigger than music. As she prepared to play, she noticed several unfamiliar faces. One family had driven nearly 2 hours. Another visitor explained that she wanted to experience the atmosphere described in the newspaper. A retired musician came simply because he was curious. The article had sparked interest everywhere. When she finally began playing, the room settled into silence. The familiar melodies floated through the air. People listened. Some smiled. Others simply relaxed and allowed the music to carry them away from daily worries. The feeling remained exactly the same. Despite the larger crowd, the heart of the gathering had not changed. It still felt personal. It still felt genuine. During a break, a woman approached carrying a folded newspaper. The article was carefully tucked beneath her arm. "I wanted to meet you." The woman smiled warmly. "I read the story 3 times. The pianist laughed. 3 times. The woman nodded. "It reminded me that small things can make a big difference." The conversation continued for several minutes. Before leaving, the woman shared something unexpected. She worked for a local charity. After reading the article, she wanted to help support programs at the community center. The news surprised everyone. The director was especially grateful. For years, the center had operated with limited resources. Additional support could make a significant difference. That conversation became the first of many. Over the following weeks, people continued reaching out. Some offered donations. Others volunteered their time. Several local businesses expressed interest in helping community projects. The positive attention created opportunities nobody had imagined. The community center slowly began receiving resources it desperately needed. Old furniture was repaired. Activity rooms received improvements. New supplies arrived for children's programs. The changes happened gradually, yet they were noticeable. Every improvement reminded people how much could happen when a community worked together. As the center continued growing, the reporter returned once again. This time he wanted to learn more about her personal story. Until now, she had mostly avoided discussing her past. She preferred focusing on the present. But the reporter believed people would appreciate understanding how her connection to music began. At first, she hesitated. Her memories felt private. Some carried happiness. Others carried sadness. Still, she trusted the reporter. So one afternoon, they sat together in a quiet room at the community center. For the first time, she shared details she rarely discussed. She spoke about her childhood. Music had always been present in her life. One family member in particular loved the piano. Whenever she visited, music filled the house. Simple melodies echoed through the rooms. The piano was never treated as something fancy or exclusive. It was simply part of everyday life. As a child, she often sat beside the piano listening carefully. Eventually, she began learning herself. The lessons became some of her favorite memories. The reporter listened closely. She described long afternoons practicing, moments of frustration, moments of progress. Most importantly, she described the joy she felt whenever music brought people together. Family gatherings often ended with songs around the piano. Laughter filled the room. People sang along. Children danced. Those memories remained precious even years later. Then life changed. Responsibilities increased. Work became more demanding. Time grew limited. Gradually, piano playing became less frequent. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. The instrument never disappeared completely from her life, but it moved into the background. The reporter asked an important question. Why did you stop playing in front of people? She thought carefully. The answer was not simple. Partly it was because life became busy. Partly it was because she lost confidence. The longer she stayed away from performing, the harder it felt to begin again. Eventually, she convinced herself that chapter of her life was finished. The reporter nodded. And then you sat down at that old piano. She smiled. Yes. Why? She laughed softly. I honestly don't know. For a moment they both laughed. Then she added something else. Maybe I just missed it. That simple answer seemed to capture everything. Sometimes people don't realize how much they miss something until they reconnect with it. The article that followed was even more popular than the first. Readers connected with the honesty of her story. Many related to the idea of setting aside passions because of life's responsibilities. Others felt inspired by her decision to begin again. Letters started arriving at the community center. Some came from people who had returned to hobbies they once loved. Others shared stories about reconnecting with family members or old friends. The effect spread farther than anyone expected. One evening, after another successful gathering, the director showed her a small stack of letters. You should read these. She spent nearly an hour going through them. Each message told a different story. Yet they all shared one thing. Hope. People felt encouraged. They felt inspired. They felt reminded that positive changes could start with something very small. As she finished reading the final letter, she sat quietly for a moment. Everything seemed almost impossible to believe. A simple decision to play an old piano had created a chain reaction nobody could have predicted. The growing crowds, the newspaper articles, the donations, the new friendships, the renewed sense of community. None of it had been planned, yet all of it was real. That evening, she walked through the nearly empty community center after everyone had gone home. The halls were quiet. The chairs had been stacked. The lights were dimmed. She eventually stopped beside the old piano. Her hand rested gently on the worn wood. A smile appeared. The piano looked exactly the same as it had on the day she first noticed it. Scratches remained visible. The finish remained faded. Nothing about it had changed. And yet everything had changed. The old instrument had become the heart of something extraordinary. As she prepared to leave, she had no idea that an even bigger surprise was waiting ahead. The growing support would soon allow the community center to launch new programs, help more people, and reach lives far beyond its walls. What started as a simple melody was about to become a gift for an entire community. The months that followed brought changes nobody could have predicted. What had started as a quiet afternoon beside an old piano continued growing far beyond the walls of the community center. Every week new visitors arrived. Some came after reading the newspaper articles. Others heard about the gatherings through friends, neighbors, or family members. Many arrived simply because they were curious. Yet most of them left with the same feeling. They felt welcomed, they felt connected, and they wanted to return. The community center soon became one of the busiest places in the area. Volunteers who once struggled to attract participants now had full schedules. Activities that previously had only a handful of attendees suddenly filled every available seat. The director often walked through the building with a smile of disbelief. Years earlier, she had worried about keeping some programs alive. Now she faced an entirely different challenge: finding enough space for everyone. One Saturday afternoon, the director invited the pianist into her office. Several papers covered the desk: donation letters, volunteer applications, community proposals. The director shook her head and laughed. "I still can't believe this." The pianist smiled. "Believe what?" The director pointed toward the papers. "All of this." She explained that support continued arriving from unexpected places. Local businesses had offered assistance. Residents volunteered their skills. Community groups wanted to partner with the center. Several donors contributed funds specifically to help expand programs. The pianist listened quietly. She still struggled to understand how any of this had happened. The director smiled. "It started with music." The pianist immediately shook her head. "It started with people." The director laughed. "Fair point." That answer had become clearer with every passing week. The piano may have opened the door, but people were the reason everything continued growing. The donations soon made visible improvements possible. One of the first projects focused on repairing parts of the building that had been neglected for years. Walls received fresh paint. Old furniture was replaced. Broken equipment was repaired. Meeting rooms became brighter and more inviting. Visitors immediately noticed the difference. The building felt renewed. But the improvements did not stop there. Several community members suggested creating free music lessons for children. The idea gained support almost instantly. Many families loved the thought of introducing young people to music regardless of their financial situation. Within weeks, plans were underway. Volunteer instructors stepped forward. Donations provided supplies. And used rooms were transformed into learning spaces. The director could hardly contain her excitement. The first day of lessons brought dozens of children through the doors. Some had never touched a musical instrument before. Others arrived carrying dreams they had never been able to pursue. The pianist spent part of that afternoon observing. The sight filled her heart. Children laughed as they experimented with sounds. Parents watched proudly from nearby chairs. The energy in the room felt contagious. One young boy carefully pressed a single piano key. The note echoed through the room. His face lit up instantly. He pressed another, then another. Soon he was smiling from ear to ear. Watching moments like that reminded her why music mattered. Not because of perfection, not because of performance, but because of joy. As the music program expanded, other opportunities appeared as well. New social gatherings were organized for senior residents. Book clubs formed. Art workshops began. Community dinners attracted large crowds. People who once spent much of their time alone now had places to gather regularly. One afternoon, she arrived early and noticed a group of older residents sitting together near the entrance. They were laughing so loudly that people across the room turned to look. The pianist recognized several faces. Months earlier, Many of them had arrived quietly and left quietly. Now they seemed completely different. One of them noticed her. "You started this." She immediately shook her head. "No, I didn't." The group laughed. One elderly woman smiled. "Maybe not intentionally," another added. "But if you never sat down at that piano, none of us would be here together." The comment made everyone pause for a moment, because deep down they knew there was some truth in it. The pianist still refused to take credit. Yet she could not ignore the impact of that first afternoon. Sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest results, even when nobody expects them to. As the seasons changed, the community center became known throughout the region. Visitors continued arriving from neighboring towns. Some attended only once. Others became regular participants. Many brought friends with them. The atmosphere remained warm and welcoming. That was what people seemed to love most. Nobody felt like an outsider. Everyone belonged. One day, a visitor approached the pianist after a gathering. The woman appeared nervous. She held a folded piece of paper in her hands. "I wrote something." The pianist smiled. "What is it?" "A letter." The woman handed it over. The pianist unfolded the paper and began reading. The letter described a difficult period in the woman's life. She had felt isolated and disconnected. Most days followed the same lonely routine. Then she discovered the community center. At first she only planned to visit once. But after hearing the piano and meeting people, she returned. Then she came back again. And again. Eventually she formed friendships. She joined activities. She became part of the community. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stood out. "Your music reminded me that life still had beautiful moments waiting for me." The pianist read that sentence several times. It was impossible not to feel emotional. Moments like these continued happening, week after week, story after story, each one different, yet all connected by the same theme: hope, connection, kindness. The community center staff eventually created a bulletin board near the entrance. Visitors began posting notes about their experiences. The board filled quickly. Messages covered every available space. Some were only a few sentences long. Others filled entire pages. The pianist often stopped to read them. One note thanked volunteers for creating a welcoming environment. Another described a friendship that formed during a music session. A third came from a parent grateful for the free lessons available to local children. Together, the notes told a remarkable story. Not about one person, about an entire community. One evening, after a particularly busy gathering, the director invited the pianist to stay behind. The building had grown quiet. Most visitors had already gone home. The director led her into one of the newly renovated rooms. Inside stood several musical instruments: a piano, a keyboard, a few guitars. Music stands lined the walls. The pianist looked around in surprise. "What is this?" The director smiled. "Our new music room." The pianist stood speechless. The room existed because of community support, because of donations, because people believed in what the center was doing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the director said something unexpected. "Do you realize how many lives have been touched by all of this?" The pianist looked around the room. Children learning music, seniors forming friendships, families spending time together, volunteers finding purpose. The answer was impossible to calculate. The impact stretched far beyond numbers. What amazed her most was how ordinary everything had seemed at the beginning. An old piano, a simple melody, a quiet afternoon. Nothing about that moment suggested it would lead here. Yet somehow it had. As she walked home that evening, she reflected on everything that had happened. The newspaper articles, the growing crowds, the community improvements, the music lessons, the friendships, the countless stories shared by visitors. She realized something important. The piano had become a gift, not because it entertained people, not because it impressed them, but because it brought them together. That gift belonged to everyone now. The children learning their first notes, the seniors finding companionship, the volunteers giving their time, the the families creating new memories. Everyone had become part of the story, and as wonderful as things already seemed, another surprise was approaching. The community center was preparing a special celebration. A day dedicated to everyone who had helped build this growing community. People from all over the area planned to attend. There would be music, stories, and unforgettable moments. What the pianist did not yet know was that the celebration would reveal just how deeply her simple piano tune had changed the lives of those around her. And when she finally saw the full impact of that first melody, she would struggle to hold back her tears. The special celebration was only a few days away. For weeks, volunteers had been preparing for the event. The community center had never attempted anything this large before. People from across the area planned to attend. Families had marked the date on their calendars. Local businesses had offered support. Volunteers spent extra hours decorating rooms and organizing activities. Everywhere she looked, there was excitement, yet she still had no idea how meaningful the day would become. The director remained unusually secretive. Whenever she asked questions, the director simply smiled. "You'll see." That answer only made her more curious. As the big day approached, attendance at the weekly gatherings continued growing. The piano sessions remained the heart of everything. No matter how much the community center expanded, people still looked forward to those familiar melodies. They had become part of the building's identity, part of its story, and part of their lives. The morning of the celebration finally arrived. Sunlight filled the streets as she left her apartment. The weather was perfect, warm but comfortable. She carried the same mixture of excitement and nervousness she had felt on the day she first sat at the old piano. As she approached the community center, she immediately noticed something extraordinary. Cars filled every available parking space. Groups of people stood outside talking and laughing. Colorful decorations surrounded the entrance. Music drifted through the air. Children ran across the lawn carrying balloons. The scene looked more like a festival than a community gathering. For a moment she simply stood there, taking it all in. The transformation was remarkable. Months earlier, the building had struggled to attract visitors. Now hundreds of people were arriving to celebrate together. A volunteer noticed her and hurried over. "We've been waiting for you," she laughed. "I just got here." "Good," the volunteer replied. "Everyone is excited." As she entered the building, applause suddenly erupted. The reaction caught her completely off guard. People throughout the room smiled and clapped. Some waved. Others thanked her as she walked past. She felt embarrassed by the attention, yet she could also feel the warmth behind it. These were not strangers anymore. Many had become friends. Many had stories connected to the piano. Many had experienced positive changes because of the community that had formed. The celebration officially began later that morning. The director welcomed everyone and thanked the volunteers, donors, staff members, and visitors who had helped support the community center. The room was packed. Every seat was occupied. Additional chairs lined the walls. People even stood near the back. After the welcome speech, several activities took place. Children performed short musical pieces they had learned through the free music program. Families shared meals together. Visitors explored displays showing photographs from the previous months. The images captured remarkable moments. Smiling faces, music lessons, community dinners, volunteer projects, friendships forming. The pianist slowly walked past the photographs. Many brought back memories. She remembered the first nervous afternoon beside the old piano. She remembered the growing crowds, the newspaper articles, the letters, the stories. Each photograph represented a small part of a much larger journey. Then came the biggest surprise of the day. The director stepped onto the stage and asked everyone to take their seats. The room gradually became quiet. The director smiled. "We wanted today to be more than a celebration." She paused. "We wanted it to be a thank you." The audience nodded. Many people already understood what was coming. The pianist did not. The director continued. "Over the past months, we've watched something amazing happen." She spoke about the growth of the community center. the friendships that had formed, the programs that had expanded, the lives that had been touched. Then she invited several people to come forward. One by one, community members approached the stage. Some were familiar faces, others she had never met before. Each person shared a short story. An elderly man spoke about memories of dancing with his wife years ago. The audience listened quietly as he described how the piano had helped him reconnect with those treasured moments. A young woman shared the story of her grandfather and the memories that returned when she heard live piano music again. A mother talked about her children discovering a love for music through the free lessons. A volunteer described how the growing community gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Story after story filled the room. Some made people laugh. Others brought tears. All of them carried the same message. The gatherings had mattered. The connections had mattered. The kindness had mattered. The pianist sat quietly listening. She never imagined that so many lives had been affected. Every story felt personal. Every story felt real. As more people shared their experiences, she found herself becoming emotional. The impact was impossible to ignore. Then something happened she would never forget. A group of children walked onto the stage. Several carried small musical instruments. Others stood beside microphones. The audience smiled immediately. The children had prepared a surprise performance. The room became silent. Then the first notes began. It was the same simple melody she had played on that very first afternoon. The tune that started everything. The melody that had drifted through the community center when nobody expected anything special. Now it returned in a completely different form. The children played carefully. Parents watched proudly. Volunteers smiled. Many audience members wiped away tears. The pianist felt her eyes fill with emotion. She had heard the melody countless times. Yet it had never sounded like this. Because now it carried meaning, carried memories, carried the story of an entire community. When the performance ended, the audience rose to its feet. Applause filled the room. The children beamed with pride. Several looked toward the pianist and smiled. The director then invited her onto the stage. She immediately shook her head. But the crowd insisted. Laughing nervously, she finally walked forward. The applause continued. For a moment she stood there speechless. The director handed her a small framed photograph. Inside was a picture of the old piano. Beneath it was a simple message. One melody can change more lives than you realize. The room became completely silent. Everyone waited. She looked around at the crowd. The children, the seniors, the volunteers, the families, the friends. All the faces that had become part of this journey. Finally, she spoke. Only a few words. I thought I was sharing music. Her voice softened. But you all shared something much bigger with me. Several people wiped away tears. She continued. You gave me friendship. She looked around the room. You gave me purpose. The audience remained silent, listening carefully. And you reminded me that simple things still matter. The applause that followed seemed endless. Yet what touched her most was not the noise. It was the expressions on people's faces. The gratitude, the warmth, the connection. After the speeches ended, the celebration continued well into the afternoon. People shared stories. Children played music. Families enjoyed meals together. Laughter filled every room. The community center felt alive. As evening approached, many visitors began heading home. The decorations remained. The conversations slowly faded. The crowds grew smaller. Eventually, the building became quiet once again. For the first time all day, she found herself alone beside the old piano. The same piano that had started everything. She sat down gently. No audience. No announcements. No expectations. Just her and the instrument. Her fingers rested on the keys. Then she played the simple melody one final time. The notes floated softly through the nearly empty room. The music sounded exactly as it had months earlier. Yet everything felt different. Because now she understood something she hadn't understood before. The true gift was never the music itself. The gift was what happened because of it. The friendships, the kindness, the conversations, the memories, the hope, the sense of belonging. A simple piano tune had become something far greater than anyone imagined. As the final note faded into silence, she smiled. The old piano remained exactly where it had always been. But its story would continue for years. Children would keep learning. Families would keep gathering. Friendships would keep growing. And every person who entered the community center would become part of that story. All because one ordinary woman sat down one afternoon and decided to play a simple tune. A tune that became an unexpected gift for everyone, including herself.